So guys, what next? We've seen the brilliant example of the Macedonian church, and I hope been challenged to think about our own hearts in comparison to that. And you've heard the ways that we can logistically make giving happen. But how are we going to connect our hearts to those logistics? How are we going to actually live this out? For many people I know who are watching this, just opening something on their phone and jotting in a donation isn't realistic, or isn't actually going to necessarily solve problems or resolve things in our hearts. So let's just think a little bit deeper about what comes next. I want to invite everyone to spend some time. Maybe you do this now in your growth group on your own on a piece of paper, or maybe you go home and do this with your spouse, if you have one, with your family, with your flatmates, whoever, people who are around you who might join you in thinking and praying. Have a think about how much, honestly, have you given to the ministry of church, or to mission, or to the poor and to social justice causes? How much in the last 12 months? And then I want to ask you to have a think about how much money you've spent on coffee or on holidays in that same amount of time. And then I also want you to compare that giving to your income or your household's combined income and ask yourself whether it's generous, whether that amount of giving says that Jesus is the Lord of your heart and of your wallet. I was given these figures, but some simple calculations. If every member of our church gave the equivalent of one large coffee a fortnight to church, we would eliminate our current deficit. If everyone gave the equivalent of a large coffee a week to church, we'd not only eliminate that deficit, but also raise enough to put on an additional MTSer in 2023. So someone like Becca's. If we all gave an extra $20 per week to church, we'd have nearly $500,000 to ask ourselves, who can we reach for Jesus with this? I want to invite you to, in your growth group, ask, what is it that stops you from being more generous? There are lots of answers. There are lots of realities. There are lots of pragmatics to take into consideration. We know that this is complicated. And the thing that we care about is the state of your hearts. And so I know some people are giving within or even beyond their means, giving generously and joyfully, and we rejoice at those who so delightedly throw themselves into God's mission. We love that. And we love that they love that as well. But we know there are some who maybe think about, I give in other ways. So I give a lot of time to church. So my service is the way that I give. Or as you know, I give when I go away on camps, or I go to different activities that church runs, and those things cost money, and so that's how I give. And whilst those things are really good, and we definitely want to affirm that, we are so thankful for serving with our lives, I want to ask, what is it that makes your wallet so sacred that you don't want to open it to Jesus? For some people, there's a real heart issue there, and I want to ask you to have a think about that. God calls us to live our whole lives for Him, not to hold anything back. We're going to continue thinking in coming weeks as we look at 1 John. The challenges are not going to stop, because 1 John is going to show us that we're called to a radical way of life. The gospel is to transform us. And next week in your groups, the first thing we're going to do is ask and talk about whether this study, this time together thinking about giving, has produced any changes. And so I want to encourage you again, even though it might feel a little bit scary or a little bit not quite how we do things on the polite North Shore, I want to encourage you to be open and honest with each other so that we give the devil no foothold and are instead joyfully encouraging one another to keep opening our hearts to how God might be working on us in this. For those who are giving sporadically, in fact, I want to specifically say something to those who might be casual workers. That's a huge part of our church, those who don't have a predictable, reliable income. I think that there are definitely ways to strategically think about how you give in a deliberate and meaningful way that doesn't necessarily require you to know in advance or pre-program how you're going to give or what you're going to give. And so that might be another thing to talk about in your group. What can you do, not knowing how much you make until after you've made it? How do you make your decisions in a helpful and godly way with that information? For those who give sporadically, I want to encourage you to think about regularity, about what that says about how you make priorities and how you make decisions. There's lots to think about and lots of ways that the wisdom of your group can contribute to each other and speak to each other and shine more and more of God's light into this area of our lives. So I pray that God blesses you as you do that your fellowship is shaped by the things that we've been learning and by the goodness of God's Spirit and God's gospel, looking at these things. Thanks very much.